I've been hired by my wife and my daughter to start making things for my daughter's upcoming wedding. The first thing that they have me making is a cake stand. And I'm going to use the 18-inch round mold that I recently got from Upstart Epoxy and a piece of Ambrosia Maple that I picked up at Woodcraft. We've already picked out pigment from Eye Candy, Glimmer, Ghost Gold. The first thing that we need to do is prepare our slab of wood for the project. Let's go. Okay, I've got the wood slab rough cut to the shape now, and I've placed my template that I made myself onto the slab so that I can flush trim it to perfectly fit the mold. Now, I will say, so I got to this point and I had to stop, and I realized that the flush trim bit that I currently have only cuts up to 1 inch, and this slab is over 1 inch, about somewhere between 1 inch and 1/8 and 1 1/4 inches, somewhere in there. So I had to stop and order a new router bit. So I went to Amazon and picked up this upcut bit. It cuts up to 1.5 inches. It's a 1/4 inch diameter from Spay Tools. I'll have it linked in my Amazon storefront. I do want to say, when you're rough cutting the wood, you want to make sure that you leave about 1/8 of an inch, really no more than 1/4 inch room on the outside of your template. That'll give room for the flush trim bit to trim that off perfectly. All right, so now we're going to get this new bit loaded up in the router table and shape this wood so we can start pouring some epoxy. All right, now that we got the lumber all milled up and ready to go into the mold, now we got to make a level surface for us to pour our epoxy on. I like to use this little piece of melamine that I've had, because I know that my floor and my table is not exactly level, so I can use this and put some shims here and there to get everything nice and level. All right, now that we got a level surface, we can put our mold on here. I want to dry fit the lumber just to make sure we're good, and we've got a perfect fit. I'm going to take this back out, and then I'm going to apply mold release to the mold. If I can get it out, maybe it's too perfect of a fit. What the mold release does is it just makes it easier to demold when it comes time, which these silicone molds are super easy to demold anyway as it is, but the mold release just helps it out a little bit. make sure that none of the resin sticks to it. But more importantly, it extends the life of your mold by helping to protect the silicone and helps to prevent tears and things like that in the mold. So here we go. Make sure you get the sides. You don't have to soak it, but you do want a nice liberal coating. Now we'll let that sit for about 5 or 10 minutes and start measuring to figure out the volume that we got to pour the epoxy. Okay, now we need to do a little bit of math. And I've already done the math ahead just because I'm filming with my phone and I use my phone for the calculator. But anyway, so we got to determine volume. And volume is basically your average length times your average width times your depth. Okay? And that gives you your volume. And then I'll tell you how to convert that to ounces. I took measurements every couple of inches, right? You know how to find the average. Add those numbers, divide it by however many measurements you took. That gives you an average. So for the length, I came up with an average of about 13 inches. For my width, about 6.4. And I know that this is 1 1/8 of an inch thick, the wood slab. So 13 times 7 times 1.125 gives me 102 and some change. Now, to convert volume, which is basically 102 is the volume, you're going to divide that number by 1.8, and that converts it to ounces. When you convert it to ounces, you get 56.875. We're going to round it up to 60 because it's always good to have more than not enough. So let's mix up some deep pour epoxy. For this pour, I'm going to be using Upstart Epoxy's deep pour resin. It's a 2-part resin mix. Mixes by volume, not by weight. 1 part hardener, 2 parts of the resin. And then we're going to be using Eye Candy's Pigment Glimmer Ghost Gold. So pretty excited about that. So because it's 1 part hardener, we'll pour the hardener up to the 20-ounce mark and then pour 40 ounces of the resin to bring it up to 60 ounces. You can use a mixer to mix this, but I find that the mixer and the paddle introduces way too many bubbles. I like to just use some type of stir stick, paint stick. With this much resin, I'll use a paint stick. With smaller pours, I'll just use a wooden craft stick. They work just fine. You want to mix, you don't want to whip it, you just want to stir it, okay? And you don't have to go too slow, but you don't want to go too fast either. As you're mixing, you want to make sure every once in a while that you're scraping the bottom and the sides, because the hardener will stick to the sides and it'll cause the resin not to mix properly. It could cause you issues down the road when with the resin curing. Generally, they recommend you mix at least about 3 minutes. The more volume you have, the longer you want to mix. What I want to do is I want to mix it until it's crystal clear. I mean, you're going to have bubbles in there, but you want to make sure that everything's mixed well. And how you can really tell is when you scrape the sides and you mix, you'll see little striations in the resin. Once you don't see those, then go just a little bit longer and you know you're good. But I always start out with at least 3 minutes and then kind of judge it from there. If I feel like it's still not mixed well by looking at it, then I'll keep going. And usually you can tell. The more you do it, the more you'll kind of know when it's mixed pretty good. Okay, I believe in full transparency. I like to share my mistakes so that you can learn from my mistakes. You're welcome. So here's where I goofed. I mixed the wrong hardener with my resin. Upstart Epoxy has a deep pour and a tabletop resin, and they have art resin. So I accidentally mixed the hardener that goes with the tabletop epoxy instead of the deep pour. So if you're keeping tabs, that's 60 ounces of resin that I just wasted. Now, are they that different and would it affect the cure? I don't know. I reached out to my contact at Upstart Epoxy and they said basically they haven't tested the mixing the resins or anything, so they can't really say that it would or would not affect the cure, but they don't recommend mixing the two. So I scrapped that 60 ounces and I've poured another 60 ounces with the correct hardener and resin. So now we start over. I will say the hardener for the deep pour is not nearly as thick of viscosity, and I think that's what threw me off and how I realized it as I was mixing. I was realizing that for deep pour it was awful thick and hard to stir, and so that caused me to look at the bottle and then I realized that I screwed up. So yeah, lesson to be learned here: pay attention to the products that you're using and don't get in a rush. Now we've got a nice clear resin and mix ratio, no striations, and we're good. We're ready to add our pigment. Now again, I'm going to be using Eye Candy Pigment's Glimmer Ghost Gold. I've never used a ghost pigment before, but when I did the test to determine which color we wanted to use on this cake stand project, this was the winner, so this is what we're going to go with. Now that we've got our resin mixed up, it's time to pour. So now I've poured my epoxy. You definitely want to take some type of heat source, whether it be a little butane torch or heat gun or something like that, and run it over to pop the bubbles on the top. The good thing about deep pour epoxy is it takes 72 hours for it to cure, and the viscosity is so thin that the bubbles will rise to the top pretty easily. But you do want to come back about every 30 minutes to an hour for the first couple of hours, just to kind of pop those top bubbles. You saw me stir. That's just, I just want to kind of get a preview of what it could look like. When you stir this early, everything's just going to move because the exothermic reaction causes the epoxy to kind of move around in the next 72 hours. So in order to get the swirls to stay, it's not really an exact science. Usually I'll come back in 12 hours to kind of test it, and about every hour after that. I've found that anywhere between 12 and 14 to 15 hours is kind of the sweet spot, but you want it to be about the viscosity of, they say, kind of peanut butter. I think that's a little bit too thick, but somewhere in that range, because you want it to where it's not going to move back, and it's really kind of a gel consistency. You definitely want to use some type of weight to weigh down the wood, otherwise it'll float up and a lot of resin will get all up underneath it. So anyway, now we wait 72 hours and demold it. Okay, the epoxy has cured, and so now it's time to demold. One of the great things I love about these silicone molds is how easy they demold. The first thing we need to do to clean this up is get all the extra or the residual epoxy that seeped around the edges of the wood on the outside. You could put this on the belt sander and work it around that way, but I found the easiest way for me is to go back to the template, if you have a template, and flush trim using this template to get that excess off. So let's do that. Now that I've got the edges trimmed, now I've got to flatten it. So this is too wide to fit through my planer. My planer is 13 inches and this is about 18 inches. So I have to use a flattening jig and get this sucker flat. Okay, so now I've got it flat on both sides. Now I want to give it a slight round over along the edges on both the bottom and the top. Okay, now that we've got the tray part of the cake stand out of the mold and cleaned up a little bit, we went ahead and poured the flood coat on the top side, and it creates some bubbles around the edges from where the epoxy dries. Yes, you can use what they call the tape method and just tape off the edges so that you don't have these bubbles, and then peel the tape off. I do that sometimes, but on a round edge like this, sometimes it's just easier to just sand it off and be done with it, because either way, even if I use the tape method, it takes so long, it takes a little while for me to use the heat gun and get the tape off of there and I still need to do some final sanding. I've done both ways, and by the time I'm finished with all of that, I could have just sanded it. So either way, I'll start with 80 grit and I'll work up to 120 and 220. We're going to finish the bottom here with some wood oil. And you don't really want to go much above 220 because then, you know, you start getting into some issues. It's a little bit more difficult for the wood to soak up the wood oil. And I mean, you can go to 320 if you want to. I find that stopping at 220 does just fine. But when we put the wood oil on here, it's going to pretty up this wood here, make it pop, and it'll make this part of the epoxy shine. So let's go ahead and get started on the sanding. I've got the bottom side all sanded up. It really wasn't that bad. I also, off camera, went and cut a small circle and then gave it a slight round over just to soften up the edges. I went back and forth, my wife and I, for weeks trying to figure out how we were going to attach a base. Here's what we're doing. We'll take this, attach it to the bottom here. I've got a base that I've painted up gold that I'm going to attach and screw to the bottom of that. So anyway, that's where we're at. Now, to put some finish on the bottom of it, I'm going to use this wood oil by Atomic Finishes. It's going to give it a nice semi-gloss sheen to it, bring out the epoxy here and the grain of the wood. So let's do that.